a person can always make a mess faster than you can clean it up, right? But still, there are debates worth having, even given that limitation. And they're the right people to have those specific debates. And there's certain topics where, I'll debate someone just because I'm the right person for the job, and it doesn't matter how messy they're going to be. It's just worth it because I can make my points land at least to the right part of the audience.
So some of it is just your own skill and competence, and also interest in preparing correctly.
Well, yeah, and the nature of the subject matter, but there are other people who just by default I would say, well, there's no reason to give this guy a platform. And there are also people who are so confabulatory that they're making such a mess with every sentence that insofar as you're even trying to interact with what they're saying, you're by definition going to fail, and you're going to seem to fail to a sufficiently large uninformed audience, where it's going to be a net negative for the cause of truth, no matter how good you are. So, like for instance, I think talking to Alex Jones on any topic for any reason is probably a bad idea, because I just think he's just neurologically wired to just utter a string of sentences. He'll get 20 sentences out, each of which is contains more lies than the last, and there's not time enough in the world to run down, and certainly not time enough in the span of a conversation to run down each of those leads to bedrock so as to falsify it. I mean, he'll just make shit up, or make shit up and then weave it in with half truths and micro truths that give some semblance of credibility to somebody out there. I mean, apparently millions of people out there, and there's just no way to untangle that in real time with him.
I have noticed that you have an allergic reaction to confabulatorization.
Yeah, confabulation. Yeah.
Confabulation.
Yeah.
That if somebody says something a little micro untruth, it really stops your brain.
Here, I'm not talking about micro untruths. I'm just talking about making up things out of whole cloth. Just like if someone says something, like, well, what about? And then the thing they put at the end of that sentence is just a set of pseudo-facts, right, that you can't possibly authenticate or not in the span of that conversation. They will, whether it's about UFOs or anything else, right, they will seem to make you look like an ignoramus when, in fact, everything they're saying is specious, right, whether they know it or not. I mean, there's some people who are just crazy. There's some people who are just bullshitting and they're not even tracking whether it's true. Yeah. It just feels good. And there's some people who are consciously lying about things.
But don't you think that's just a kind of jazz masterpiece of untruth that you should be able to just wave off by saying like, well, none of that is backed up by any evidence, and just almost like take it to the humor place?
Well, yeah, but the thing is I mean, just the place I'm familiar with doing this and not doing this is on specific conspiracies like 9/11 truth, right? Like the 9/11. So because of what 9/11 did to my intellectual life, I mean, it really just, it sent me down a path for the better part of a decade. Like I became a critic of religion when I don't know if I was ever going to be a critic of religion, right? Like, but it happened to be in my wheelhouse because I had spent so much time studying religion on my own, and I was also very interested in the underlying spiritual concerns of every religion, and so I devoted more than a full decade of my life to just what is real here, what is possible, what is the nature of subjective reality, and how does it relate to reality at large, and is there anything to who was someone like Jesus or Buddha, and are these people frauds, or are these just myths, or is there really a continuum of insight to be had here that is interesting? So I spent a lot of time on that question through the full decade of my 20s.
And that was launched in part by 9/11 Truther?
No, but then when 9/11 happened, I had spent all this time, reading religious books, empathically understanding the motivations of religious people, right? Knowing just how fully certain people believe what they say they believe, right? So I took religious convictions very seriously. And then people started flying planes into our buildings, and I knew that there was something to be said about
allegedly
the core doctrines of Islam. Yeah, exactly. So I went down. So that became my wheelhouse for a time. Terrorism and jihadism and related topics. And so the 9/11 truth conspiracy thing kept, getting aimed at me. And the question was, well, do I want to debate these people, right?
Yeah.
Like
Alex Jones, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. So Alex Jones, I think, was an early purveyor of it, although I don't think I knew who he was at that point. And privately, I had some very long debates with people who, one person in my family went way down that rabbit hole, and I just, every 6 months or so, I'd literally write the 2-hour email, that would try to deprogram him, however ineffectually, and so I went back and forth for years on that topic with in private with people, but I could see the structure of the conspiracy. I could see the nature of how impossible it was to play whack-a-mole sufficiently well so as to convince anyone of anything who was not seeing the problematic structure of that way of thinking. I mean, it's not actually a thesis. It's a proliferation of anomalies that you can't actually connect all the dots that are being pointed to. They don't connect in a coherent way. They're incompatible theses that are not, and their incompatibility is not being acknowledged. But they're running this algorithm of things are never what they seem. There's always malicious conspirators doing things perfectly. That we see evidence of human incompetence everywhere else. No one can tie their shoes, expertly anywhere else, but over here, people are perfectly competent. They're perfectly concealing things. Like thousands of people are collaborating, inexplicably. I mean, incentivized by what? Who knows? They're collaborating to murder thousands of their neighbors, and no one is breathing a peep about it. No one's getting caught on camera. No one's breathed a word of it to a journalist. And so I've dealt with that style of thinking, and I know what it's like to be in the weeds of a conversation like that, and the person will say, okay, well, but what do you make of the fact that all those F-16s were flown 800 miles out to sea on the morning of 9/11 doing an exercise that hadn't even been scheduled for that day, but it was. And now all of these are, I dimly recall some thesis of that kind, but I'm just making these things up now, right? So like that detail hadn't even been scheduled for that day. It was inexplicably run that day. Like, so how long would it take to track that down? Right, the idea that this is anomalous, like that there was a F-16 exercise run on it, and it wasn't even supposed to be run that day. Right, someone like Alex Jones, their speech pattern is to pack as much of that stuff in as possible at the highest velocity that a person can speak, and unless you're knocking down each one of those things to that audience, you appear to just be uninformed. You appear to just not be. You don't. Wait, he didn't know about the F-16s.
Yeah. Sure.
He doesn't know about Project Mockingbird. You haven't heard about Project Mockingbird? I just made up Project Mockingbird. I don't know what it is, but that's the kind of thing that comes tumbling out in a conversation like that. And that's the kind of thing, frankly, I was worried about in the COVID conversation, because not that someone like Brett would do it consciously, but someone like Brett is swimming in a sea of misinformation on social, living on Twitter, getting people sending the blog post and the study from the Philippines that showed that in this cohort ivermectin did X, right? And not like to actually run anything to ground, right? You have to actually do the work journalistically and scientifically and run it to ground, right? So for some of these questions, you actually have to be a statistician to say, okay, they used the wrong statistics in this experiment, right? Now, yes, we could take all the time to do that, or we could at every stage along the way, in a context where we have experts we can trust, go with what 97% of the experts are saying about X, about the safety of mRNA, about the transmissibility of COVID, about whether to wear masks or not wear masks. And I completely agree that broke down unacceptably over the last few years.